A Turkish mountain has silenced researchers for decades. It sits at roughly 5,200 meters above sea level on the border of Turkey and Iran, wrapped in glacial ice for most of the year and genuinely hostile to anyone who attempts to reach its upper elevations without serious preparation. On its northwestern slope, partially buried in rock and compacted earth, sits a boat-shaped formation approximately 164 meters long that has been generating arguments among geologists, archaeologists, theologians, and conspiracy theorists since it was first photographed from the air in 1959. A team finally went inside. What they found has made the argument significantly more complicated than anyone on either side of it was prepared to handle. The formation everyone has always argued about, Mount Ararat, appears in the Book of Genesis. That is where most people's knowledge of it begins, and, for a significant portion of the population, where it also ends. The biblical account of Noah's flood places the ark coming to rest on the mountains of Ararat following a catastrophic deluge, and since at least the early Christian period, various traditions have located that landing on the volcanic peak now sitting on the eastern edge of Turkey near the borders of Iran and Armenia. The mountain itself is genuinely imposing in a way that photographs do not fully communicate. Greater Ararat, the main peak, rises to 5,137 meters. It is the highest point in Turkey. It is covered in permanent ice and snow. It generates its own weather patterns that have nothing to do with whatever is happening in the valleys below. And it sits in a geopolitically sensitive border region that has been, at various points in the last century, actively closed to researchers, tourists, and pretty much everyone else, for reasons that had nothing to do with the mountain itself, and everything to do with the complicated modern history of that particular corner of the world. About 30 kilometers from the main summit, on a lower formation sometimes called the Durupınar site, after the Turkish Air Force captain İlhan Durupınar, who first noticed it during a 1959 aerial mapping mission, sits the formation at the center of this entire conversation. It is a distinct, elongated, boat-shaped mound rising out of the surrounding terrain on the northwestern slope, roughly 164 meters long, about 50 meters wide at its broadest point, oriented in a direction that, depending significantly on who is doing the interpreting, either means something genuinely important or means nothing at all. From the air, the resemblance to a large vessel is striking enough that Durupınar, a military pilot with no theological agenda whatsoever and no particular reason to see boats in Turkish mountainsides, immediately flagged it as unusual and made sure it ended up in the photographic record. That photograph eventually found its way to people who were very interested in it for reasons that had everything to do with Genesis, and the argument has been running more or less continuously in one form or another ever since. 65 years of argument, which is, honestly, an impressive run for a hill in eastern Turkey. Why this mountain has pulled people in. The idea of finding Noah's Ark physically, verifiably, on a mountain in eastern Turkey has exercised a particular hold on a specific kind of imagination for a very long time. And I say that without condescension toward that impulse, because the desire to find physical confirmation of ancient texts is not irrational on its face. Archaeology has repeatedly demonstrated that ancient accounts dismissed as myth contain genuine historical cores that reward serious investigation. Troy was considered legend until Heinrich Schliemann started digging in northwestern Turkey in the 1870s and found it. Sodom and the cities of the plain were dismissed as biblical invention until researchers began identifying Bronze Age settlements in the Jordan Valley with destruction layers that matched the general chronology. The impulse to look for physical evidence of ancient stories is not inherently foolish. It has produced real results in real places, and the scientific community's default dismissal of that impulse has sometimes been wrong in embarrassing ways that took decades to fully acknowledge. But the Noah's Ark search occupies a specific and complicated category of that impulse, one where the desired conclusion precedes the investigation in ways that have, historically, made the resulting research genuinely difficult to evaluate without already knowing which direction you were hoping it would go. Dozens of expeditions have traveled to Ararat over the decades since the Durupınar site was first photographed. Some were led by serious researchers with legitimate credentials and genuine methodological care. Some were led by enthusiasts with strong prior commitments to a particular outcome who were going to find confirmation regardless of what the evidence actually said. A few claimed to have found wood, chambers, ancient rope, petrified timber. Several of those claims collapsed under scrutiny almost immediately upon contact with independent review. The result is a body of literature around this site that requires significant patience to navigate productively, because the signal-to-noise ratio is not always what a reader hoping for clean answers would prefer. You have to hold the legitimate scientific findings separate from the credulous claims, and the line between them is not always clearly drawn by the people writing about it. I am going to try to draw that line as carefully as I can throughout this video, which means some of what follows will be less dramatic than the headlines you may have already seen. That is the deal. The honest version of this story is interesting enough that it does not need embellishment, and I would rather give you the honest version than the embellished one that sends you away confident about something the data does not actually support. What researchers actually found going in. A joint research team from Ağrı İbrahim Çeçen University and Istanbul Technical University conducted a systematic study of the Durupınar Formation that went further than previous surveys in several important technical ways. The research, published in 2023 and drawing on fieldwork conducted over multiple seasons, used a combination of ground-penetrating radar, soil sampling, and direct core extraction to analyze what the formation is actually made of beneath its surface layer. Ground-penetrating radar is exactly what it sounds like, and I always appreciate when a piece of scientific equipment has a name that requires no translation. Radar pulses are fired into the ground and bounce back differently depending on what they hit, allowing researchers to build a picture of subsurface structure without having to excavate everything physically. It is the same technology used in forensic investigations, infrastructure surveys, battlefield archaeology, and geological research around the world. It is genuinely useful. It is also not magic, and what it returns is data that requires interpretation, which means two teams looking at the same radar returns can sometimes reach different conclusions depending entirely on what assumptions they bring to the analysis. That is not a flaw in the technology. That is just how interpretation works when the evidence is ambiguous. The radar survey of the Durupınar site returned something that got a lot of attention very quickly once results became public. Subsurface features showing what appeared to be distinct compartments or chambers beneath the formation's surface. Organized spaces separated by what the radar suggested were vertical structures of some kind. The initial reporting on this finding was enthusiastic in ways that significantly outran what the data actually supported, as initial reporting on things like this has a remarkable tendency to do regardless of the subject matter. But the subsurface structural anomaly itself is real. That part is not disputed by the research team or by independent reviewers. Something beneath the surface of this formation is producing radar returns that differ from the surrounding terrain in organized, repeated, geometrically consistent ways. That is a genuine finding, and it deserves to be treated as one. The soil sampling results were, in some respects, even more interesting and considerably less discussed in the public coverage that followed. Samples taken from the interior of the formation showed a clay mineral composition that differed measurably from samples taken from the surrounding hillside terrain. The interior samples contained higher concentrations of potassium, higher levels of marine deposits, and significantly higher levels of organic materials than the control samples from the immediate surroundings. That differentiation is real. It is documented in the published research. And it requires an explanation, even if the explanation ultimately turns out to be geological rather than archaeological. The interior analysis nobody was ready for here is the part that the more enthusiastic coverage glossed over in a hurry to get to the dramatic conclusion. The organic material found in the interior soil samples did not look like processed timber. It did not look like worked wood, shaped planks, or construction material of any recognizable kind. What it looked like was decomposed organic matter consistent with what you would expect from biological material, plant material, possibly animal material, incorporated into sediment over a very long period of time under specific environmental conditions that favored preservation of organic compounds even as structural integrity was entirely lost. That is not a trivial distinction. The argument for the Durupınar Formation being the physical remains of Noah's Ark rests substantially on the expectation that there should be structural wood somewhere inside it. Ancient, degraded, partially petrified, but wood nonetheless. Shaped wood. Wood that shows evidence of having been cut, assembled, and deliberately constructed into something. The soil analysis did not find that. What it found was organic material consistent with the kind of biological incorporation you would expect in a geological formation that has been accumulating sediment, debris, and surrounding environmental material for thousands of years without any human construction involved whatsoever. The distinction matters enormously, and I want to sit with it for a moment because it keeps getting buried under the excitement of the broader claim. Organic material in a geological formation is unremarkable. Organic material arranged in patterns consistent with deliberate construction, shaped, cut, assembled, with tool marks or joinery visible under analysis, would be a completely different category of finding. The 2023 study did not report the second category. The headlines suggesting otherwise were extrapolating significantly beyond what the published data actually supported, which is a charitable way of saying the headlines were wrong about what the study found. I want to be precise here because precision is exactly what this particular topic desperately needs and almost never gets from the people covering it. The researchers themselves did not claim to have found Noah's Ark. The lead researchers were careful and measured in how they characterized their findings in the published literature. They identified anomalies worth investigating further. They found soil composition differences that require explanation. They documented subsurface structural features that are genuinely unusual when compared to surrounding terrain. None of that constitutes proof of anything beyond the fact that this formation is geologically interesting and deserves continued rigorous scientific attention. That is a real finding. It is just a considerably quieter and less headline-friendly one than the coverage implied, which is presumably why the coverage implied something else instead. The geological explanation, nobody wanted to hear geology, has an explanation for the Durupınar Formation that does not require an arc. It requires a mud flow, and I understand that sentence lands with considerably less drama than the alternative, but the evidence supporting it is substantial enough that dismissing it requires more effort than most popular coverage of this site is willing to invest. The eastern Anatolian region where Mount Ararat sits is one of the most geologically active zones in the world. The Arabian tectonic plate is pushing north into the Eurasian plate along a collision zone that has been building the mountains of eastern Turkey for millions of years through processes that are ongoing right now, not ancient history. The result is a landscape characterized by significant volcanic activity, frequent seismic events, and the kind of ongoing terrain instability that produces, among other things, large-scale mudflows. These are not gentle, gradual processes. They are events that can move enormous quantities of material with considerable speed, shape that material into elongated deposits with surprisingly organized internal structure, and leave formations that persist in the landscape for thousands of years looking like something they are not. Geologists examining the Durupınar site have noted that its orientation, its elongated shape, and its position relative to the surrounding hillside are all consistent with a petrified mudflow deposit. The subsurface structural features detected by ground-penetrating radar, the compartment-like spaces that got so much attention in the initial coverage, could represent differential compaction within such a deposit. Harder and softer zones created by the way different materials of different densities settled and compressed over time, rather than deliberately constructed chambers. The differing mineral composition of interior versus exterior soil samples is consistent with the sorting and stratification that routinely occurs within mudflow deposits as materials of different weights and chemical compositions settle at different rates over time. This explanation does not require any ancient event other than the ordinary, if sometimes spectacular, geological processes that have been shaping this particular region continuously for an extraordinarily long time. It is not a satisfying explanation for everyone with a prior interest in a different answer. But geological explanations for geological formations have a baseline plausibility that alternative explanations need to actually clear before they can be taken as seriously as the coverage sometimes implies they already have been. The shape is the hardest part of the mudflow explanation to make fully intuitive. It does look like a boat. That is simply true, and denying it does not help anyone understand the actual situation more clearly. But the geological literature on mudflow morphology includes elongated deposits with organically curved outlines that can produce shapes strikingly similar to what the aerial photography of Durupınar shows. Nature is, it turns out, quite capable of producing shapes that look intentional without any intention being involved whatsoever. Anyone who has spent meaningful time looking at clouds, rock formations, or coastlines already has direct personal experience of this phenomenon. The organic material problem. Let's spend some time on the organic material because it is genuinely the most contested and most interesting piece of the current research. The claim that has gotten the most traction in both the academic literature and the popular coverage is that organic material found within the formation's soil composition is anomalous in ways that standard geological processes struggle to explain. Specifically, the concentrations of certain organic compounds found in the interior samples are higher than what you would expect from simple sediment accumulation in a formation of this type and age. The question is what to make of that. An honest answer is that the research community has not yet reached a settled consensus. One interpretation is that the organic material represents decomposed biological matter that was incorporated into the formation from the surrounding environment over thousands of years. Vegetation, animal remains, the accumulated biological debris of a landscape that has been ecologically active throughout the Holocene. Under this interpretation, the elevated organic content is interesting but not anomalous enough to demand an extraordinary explanation. A second interpretation, the one favored by researchers with a prior commitment to the arc hypothesis, is that the organic material represents decomposed timber, ancient wood that has broken down over millennia into its chemical components, leaving behind organic signatures that are detectable in soil analysis even after the structural integrity of the original material is long gone. Under this interpretation, the chemistry of the soil is telling you something was here that is no longer structurally visible. The problem is that these two interpretations produce similar soil chemistry signatures. Distinguishing between them requires a level of chemical specificity in the analysis that the current published research does not fully achieve. Lignin, the primary structural compound in wood, does break down into specific chemical components over time that can sometimes be detected in soil analysis. Whether the organic compounds found at Durupınar include those specific lignin breakdown products in concentrations that clearly indicate ancient timber rather than general biological accumulation is a question the published data does not cleanly answer. That ambiguity is real. It is not a cover-up. It is just the honest state of the science at this point. And it is exactly the kind of ambiguity that makes continued, rigorous, properly funded investigation genuinely worthwhile rather than a waste of resources. The teams who got here before this is not the first serious scientific investigation of the Durupınar site, and understanding the history of prior investigations matters significantly for putting the current research in proper context. The site has attracted researchers with widely varying levels of scientific credibility and widely varying levels of prior commitment to a particular conclusion for several decades. Ron Wyatt deserves mention here because his name comes up constantly in any discussion of this site, and because accurately characterizing his work is important for calibrating the overall evidentiary picture. Wyatt was an amateur archaeologist with no formal geological or archaeological training who visited the site repeatedly from the 1970s onward and made a series of claims about what he found. His claims were enthusiastically received in certain circles and essentially ignored by the professional scientific community. Wyatt claimed to have found fossilized wood, claimed to have identified anchor stones in the surrounding landscape, claimed to have detected metal fittings consistent with large-scale construction. Independent researchers who examined his evidence found it unconvincing at best, and in some cases, simply inaccurate. His work is not a reliable foundation for any claim about this site, and treating it as though it carries scientific weight does a disservice to the genuinely interesting, legitimate research that has been conducted here. More credible was the work conducted by geophysicists using ground-penetrating radar in the 1980s and 1990s, including work associated with researchers connected to institutions with real scientific standing. Those early radar surveys did detect subsurface anomalies and generated genuine scientific interest among people who had no prior theological commitment to any particular finding. They also generated interpretive disagreements that were not resolved cleanly, partly because the radar technology available at the time was significantly less sophisticated than what current teams are working with, and partly because the results were seized upon and publicized by advocates before the scientific community had finished the slower work of actually evaluating what the data showed. The 2023 research represents the most methodologically rigorous engagement with the Durupınar site to date, and that matters. Better technology, better sampling methodology, better analytical frameworks, and a research team that has been more careful than most of its predecessors about the critical distinction between what the data actually shows and what some people very much want it to show. That carefulness is worth acknowledging and respecting even when the conclusions it produces are considerably less dramatic than the headlines implied. Careful, honest science at a contentious site is genuinely valuable, regardless of whether it produces the answer anyone was hoping for. What the data says without agenda. Let's try to state clearly what the evidence actually supports at this moment, setting aside the motivated reasoning of the committed believers and the reflexive dismissiveness of those who decided the whole thing was obvious nonsense before engaging seriously with the findings. The Durupınar Formation is a real geological feature with a genuinely unusual shape that has been documented consistently since 1959, that is established and not seriously disputed by anyone engaging honestly with the site. The ground-penetrating radar surveys have identified subsurface structural anomalies that clearly differentiate the interior of the formation from the surrounding terrain in organized ways. Those anomalies are real, documented across multiple survey seasons using improving technology, and they require a geological explanation, whether that explanation ultimately turns out to be mundane or significant. The soil composition of the formation's interior differs measurably from the surrounding hillside in ways that include elevated organic content and distinct clay mineral profiles that do not appear in control samples from immediately adjacent areas. None of those findings, individually or in combination, constitutes evidence that this formation is the physical remains of a wooden vessel. What they constitute is evidence that this formation is geologically unusual in ways that are not yet fully explained by existing models and that warrant continued serious scientific investigation. That is a meaningful and legitimate finding. It is simply not the finding that most of the popular coverage chose to present when the 2023 research became public. The absence of identifiable structural timber, or even chemical signatures that unambiguously indicate ancient decomposed timber rather than general biological accumulation, is a significant gap between the evidence and the conclusion that enthusiastic coverage has been drawing. Science does not close that gap by deciding in advance what is on the other side of it. It closes it by doing more analysis, collecting more samples, applying more chemically specific techniques, and following the data wherever it actually leads, rather than wherever the researcher arrived hoping it would go. That work is ongoing. The honest position right now is interest and continued investigation, not confirmation and definitely not debunking. Why this debate will never fully die. There is something worth acknowledging about why this particular question generates the kind of sustained, heated, never quite resolved argument that it does. And it is not simply that one side is rational and the other is not, though the coverage often implies exactly that, with varying degrees of subtlety, depending on which direction the bias runs. The Noah's Ark story occupies a unique position in the cultural and religious landscape of a large portion of humanity. For hundreds of millions of people across multiple religious traditions, the flood narrative is not a myth in the pejorative sense. It is a foundational account that sits at the center of their understanding of human history, divine action, and the relationship between those two things. The desire to find physical confirmation of that account is not intellectually dishonest. It is a natural human response to a deeply held belief. The problem is that desire, when it precedes investigation, produces exactly the research pathologies that the history of the Durupınar site illustrates so clearly. Evidence gets overinterpreted. Ambiguous findings get presented as confirmation. Contradictory data gets minimized or explained away. and the credibility of legitimate anomalies gets damaged by association with claims that cannot survive serious scrutiny. The geological community's reflexive dismissiveness creates its own version of the same problem from the opposite direction. Interesting anomalies get written off without adequate investigation because the cultural associations of the site make serious engagement feel professionally risky. That is not how science is supposed to work either. A formation with genuinely unusual subsurface features and measurably anomalous soil composition deserves rigorous investigation, regardless of what story some people want the investigation to confirm. What this means for the bigger picture, the Durupınar site sits in a broader context worth stepping back to consider. Flood narratives appear in the cultural traditions of peoples across an enormous geographic range, from the Mesopotamian Epic of Gilgamesh, which predates the biblical account and shares enough structural similarity to suggest a common historical ancestor, to flood stories from South Asia, from the Americas, from the Pacific Islands. This distribution has led serious researchers to ask whether these narratives share a common origin in actual geological events. The answer, based on the available geological evidence, appears to be yes, with important caveats. The end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 to 6,000 years ago, involved genuinely catastrophic flooding events at regional and in some cases continental scales. The filling of the Black Sea Basin, which some researchers have proposed as a potential historical basis for Mesopotamian flood traditions, involved the rapid inundation of a large freshwater lake by Mediterranean seawater as melting glaciers raised ocean levels past the threshold of what is now the Bosphorus. That event, if the timeline and scale proposed by researchers William Ryan and Walter Pittman are approximately correct, would have been genuinely catastrophic for any human communities living in that basin. Whether that event, or any other specific geological episode, is the historical basis for the Genesis flood account is a question archaeology and geology cannot answer cleanly from the available evidence. What they can say is that catastrophic flooding on a scale that would be remembered and transmitted across generations is not a mythological invention. It is geological reality. The question of whether that geological reality involved a specific wooden vessel carrying a specific family and a comprehensive collection of animals, and whether the remains of that vessel are sitting on a Turkish mountainside, is a question the current evidence at Durupınar does not resolve. In either direction, that is the honest state of this. Not a confirmation, not a debunking, a genuinely unusual formation in a geologically extraordinary region, with anomalies that current science has not fully explained, sitting at the intersection of one of the oldest and most consequential stories in human cultural history. The researchers who went inside found something more complicated than either the believers or the skeptics were fully prepared to deal with, which is, if you think about it, exactly what you should expect from a place that has been generating arguments for 65 years without resolving them. The mountain keeps its secrets well. And the team that went inside found that getting closer does not always mean getting clearer. Sometimes it just means the question gets more specific and more difficult in exactly equal measure. That is not a failure of the research. That is what honest inquiry into hard questions actually looks like when nobody is forcing the data to say something it has not earned the right to say.